Hey, good morning, Restoration Church. Thank you for joining us on our house church Sunday. Every once in a while, we like to get out of the box and kind of return to our roots. You know, it says that the church in Acts, what they did is they gathered together in the temple courts, but then they also gathered together in each other's homes. And it says that when they did that, there was just this life that happened, and it was beautiful, and God added to the number those who are being saved. So hopefully you're having a great time in the living room where you're at and just joining together with people and having fun in relationship. We're going to jump in this morning back into our series called the God series, and we're talking about the names of God. And what do the names of God reveal about who he is, and also what do they reveal about who we are? See, these names are all throughout Scripture, different names that capture a different facet of God's character, his heart. And they're names that either God ascribes to himself or names that people who know God best ascribe to him. And so looking at those really just helps us to dive into the heart and mind of God and understand him better. So that's what we're doing. Today we're jumping back into the book of Genesis, into a story about a guy named Abraham and his son Isaac. And this story, it's kind of a hard story. It's one that's hard to get our head around. It's a deeply personal story because God shows up and says to Abraham, Abraham, I want you to take your son Isaac, who is the fruit of a promise that I gave you years ago, and I want you to sacrifice him to me on an altar in a place that I'm going to show you. Again, to us, reading that today, that sounds so difficult and hard to get our head around. It sounds almost barbaric in a way because it is. It's just a hard story. But in it, I think God is trying to reveal something about who he is to us. And he was revealing the same thing to Abraham all those years ago. So we're going to pick up the story. Again, this is starting in verse 6 of chapter 22. This is after God has already invited Abraham to go. It says, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, starting in verse 6, and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went out together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. Hey, the fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So you can see even there in the foreshadowing in Abraham's response. So the two of them went on together, it says. When they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar, and there he arranged the wood on it. And he bound his son Isaac, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand, and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, Abraham replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called that place Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So there's a lot going on in this story, but like I said, right embedded in there is this idea of God's faithfulness, that he is a God who will provide. And there's a beautiful piece of that, the names that Abraham gives God, the name that Abraham gives God there. One is that it's future tense. God will provide. That in the end, God will make it right. In the end, God will be faithful to his promises, and that we can trust that. And the second one is that the more literal translation of Jireh, the second word there, is that God will see to it, that he will faithfully fulfill his promises, that he is faithful, that is his heart. Now, I've struggled over the years with this story because, like I said, it seems so personal, so extreme to ask somebody to sacrifice their son, especially their only son. I mean, I have two sons, and I just can't imagine what that would be like as a father. And it says even at the opening of the story that God was testing Abraham. And there's just an extreme level of trust that God is trying to mine in Abraham. I want you to sacrifice your son, your only son. And so I've often wondered, how did Abraham struggle with that ask? Because it is a huge ask. And it almost seems nonsensical to us now. And the truth is, I'm sure Abraham did struggle, that he wrestled with this idea, this ask that God had put to him. But when you read the story, one of the things that you see in there is that Abraham was willing to act on his faith. that he was convinced that God would provide, regardless of how much it cost. In Hebrews, it tells us not only did Abraham trust that God would provide a way out, but he said even if God had been asked to sacrifice his son, that the Lord was powerful enough and faithful enough to resurrect him, to bring him back to life. That was where Abraham's confidence was. So because Abraham knew something I think that's so important for us to know in the name Jehovah Jireh. He knew that though we don't often see what's going on in the moment, we do know that God will provide in the end. We don't often see in the moment what God will do in the end. All the background of this story, all of the main characters had to go through sort of a valley experience where they were asked to step out in faith and trust, and they didn't see in the moment what God was going to do in the end. But God always proved himself faithful. That's why this is a journey of faith for us, and why the name Jehovah Jireh means so much, because we believe that God will see to it, that he will make sure that what needs to happen happens. It's deeply personal for us because faith is deeply personal. In fact, when you really unpack that name Jireh, Jehovah Jireh, what it means is that God sees us in our need and that he will provide in the end. He sees our need and he will provide in the end. That's the phrase, the whole meaning of that name. And so while we don't see in the moment what God will do in the end, we can trust that he is Jehovah Jireh, the God who will provide in the end. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as I read through this story this time, I was really captured by another question. And it is the question, whose heart is really being revealed in this? See, Abraham was tested, and his heart of faith was being mined and opened up because he trusted that God would provide. But there's another aspect to this where I think the heart of God is being revealed in a deeper way. See, because there's these phrases or these words, this mirror language that happens in the Bible. When words and phrases occur a couple of times, that we're supposed to pay attention to it. And so in Genesis 22, it says, Abraham called Isaac his son, his only son. God says to Abraham, God, I want you to sacrifice your son, your only son. And now I see that you have not withheld your son, your only son. I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to fulfill all these promises. And so this mirror language for us is something to pay attention to because, and here's the key, God didn't ask Abraham to do something that he wasn't himself willing to do. Because thousands of years later, when Jesus shows up, John recounts it this way. He says that God gave his son, his only son, that whoever would believe in him should not perish but have everlasting life. In fact, in Romans 8, it says it even more directly. It's so beautiful. He says, and we know, this is a famous passage, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. But then he goes on and says, what shall we say then in response to this? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? So in that phrase, your son, your only son, there is a foreshadowing that's happening. That God is saying to Abraham, I am willing to experience everything that I'm inviting you to experience. I'm willing to sacrifice my son. I will not withhold my son, my only son, so that you can be made right with God. See, while it is deeply personal for Abraham, this ask, I think it is also deeply personal for God, because it was telling a story that had yet to come to pass. It was foreshadowing what God would do as a sacrifice for you and for me. And so the lesson that I take out from that is that while this story is so deeply personal on a human level, it also reveals to us that God is deeply, passionately invested in our stories. He is Jehovah Jireh, the God who sees my need and will go to whatever lengths to provide. This is the God that we believe in, Jehovah Jireh. So as you gather now, we're going to break up and have some conversation around this idea of maybe read that scripture passage again. The hosts are going to kind of lead through a discussion guide. But we're just grateful that you're here and we get to reorient ourselves around Jesus again, and to ask some big questions, and to hopefully see God in a new light. He is Jehovah Jireh, the God who will provide. Thanks for being with us this morning.